The card was the size of a calling card, and twice as cruel. It was lacquered cream, edged in gilt, and at the top of it, in a copper plate so neat it might have been engraved by a watchmaker, were the words, "The 12 Suitors of Miss Isadora Vane, April to June, season of 1815. Beneath that, in a smaller, sharper hand, lay the 12 names her father had set out for her in lieu of a future. The cards had gone out the night before to every fashionable house in Mayfair. A scandal sheet had already copied them onto its second page, under the headline, "A Wager, a Lady, a List." By breakfast, the news was in 3 coffee houses and a barber's shop on Bond Street. By the time Isadora came down to the morning room, the card was waiting beside her teacup like an unexploded shell. She picked it up. The gilt was still tacky at one corner, where some impatient printer had not let the ink set. A faint smudge of it transferred to the pad of her thumb. She rubbed it away against the linen of the tablecloth and watched the small gold stain bloom on the white. It would not wash out. Few things, she had begun to think, ever did. She read the names slowly, as though slow reading might unmake them. Lord Petersmark of Wexley, Sir Henry Aubrey Lisle, the Honourable Mr. Cassian Frost, the Earl of Whithorn, Mr. Mortimer Castle, the Viscount Dereham, Sir Bertram Quill, Mr. Augustus Pell, Colonel Owen Hayde, Lord Felton Marchby, Mr. Silas Underwood, Mr. Edmund Lovelace. 12 names. 12 months ago, she had been a girl reading novels in the window seat at Vane Hall, and her father had been a country baronet with a clever wife and a quiet purse. Then a great-uncle in Yorkshire had been less careful with a candle than he ought, and the Vane fortune had quietly tripled by inheritance, and her father had decided, overnight, the way men of small imagination always decide great things, that his daughter must marry into a title before midsummer. He had set down 12 names. He had set down rules. He had set out the cards. The 13th name was not on the card. The 13th name was the reason the scandal sheet's headline was already on its second printing. Outside the long sash window, the plane trees of the square moved a little in the warm April wind. A milk cart rattled past. A nursemaid crossed the garden in the centre of the square with 2 small, clean children in white and a small dog at her ankle. And somewhere, a sparrow was making the small, bright bother of a sparrow's morning. The world, as Isadora had often had occasion to observe, did not stop for the printing of cards. The world went on, with its milk and its children and its sparrows, and the cards arrived all the same. The needle moved through the linen with a soft, small sound. "Read it again, my love," said Aunt Lavinia, from the chair by the fire, without lifting her eyes from the embroidery in her lap. "Read it aloud, so I may hear how absurd it is in your own voice." Isadora set the card down. The gilt edge caught the morning light. "Aunt, it will not become less absurd by repetition." "That is precisely how it becomes less absurd. By the 3rd reading, the words go quite flat. They no longer have any meaning at all. Then one may sit down to breakfast." Lavinia took a stitch. "Try it." She drew a breath. "Lord Petersmark of Wexley." Aunt Lavinia took a stitch. "There. Already he sounds like a sneeze. Continue." She kept her voice level. "Sir Henry Aubrey Lisle." Another stitch. A sneeze followed by a sigh. Isadora set both palms flat on the linen of the table. Aunt Lavinia. "My dear, the only reasonable response to a list is a survey of its absurdities. Your father has had his fit of pride. The list is out. The list cannot be unprinted. We have 3 months. We will not waste them on tears." She glanced up, and her thin mouth softened into something not quite a smile. "We may, however, waste a great deal of them on opinions." Isadora sat down at the table. She did not pour tea. She did not pick up the toast. She stared at the card and at the precise gilt edge of it, and the morning room, gold silk papers, the cream aubusson, the long sash windows opening onto the square, felt suddenly like a room set up for a public auction. Which, of course, it was. The teapot smelled faintly of bergamot. A coal shifted in the grate with a soft thud. From the kitchen below came the small, competent rattle of pans and the voice of the cook scolding a maid about the temperature of an egg. Above her, in his study, her father was already pacing. 3 steps east, a pause. 3 steps west. The same pattern he had walked for 30 years, the floorboards under the green turkey carpet creaking on the same 2 boards each time. She had grown up with that pacing. It had been the bass note of her childhood. It had not, in all the years she had listened to it, ever once altered its rhythm. There were rules to the auction. Her father had written them on a separate sheet in his neat hand and pinned the sheet to the back of her dressing-room door, because he was not the sort of man who would consider a daughter might prefer privacy in such matters. Each suitor would call on her in turn, in the order set down, and would have the parlour for 1 hour. None might call out of order. None might bring a gift exceeding £20 in value, which was, her father had explained, the precise sum at which a gift ceased to be a courtesy and became an inducement. There were to be no private interviews. Aunt Lavinia would be present, embroidery in lap, opinions on tongue. There were to be no walks alone in the garden. There were to be no notes exchanged outside the parlour hour. And at the end of the season, on the morning of midsummer, Isidora was to come down the great staircase and stand at the foot of it and name one of the 12. After which there was to be no further discussion of the matter on the part of the bride. The bride. The word was already on the card. Isidora pressed her thumb against the gilt edge until it left a small smudge. Then she lifted her teacup with a steady hand and said, in the voice she used when she meant to be very precise, "Aunt, did you know about the Duke?" The needle paused. The needle paused for half a beat. "Which Duke, my dear?" She kept her hand on the rim of the saucer. "You know perfectly well which Duke." The needle went on. 2 stitches. 3. "I knew there was a Duke." "Then you also knew he is not on the card." "I knew there was a Duke," said Aunt Lavinia again, more carefully this time, "and that he had sent your father a letter, and that your father has been the colour of a beetroot since 7 this morning. I have not had the courage to ask the details. I assumed you would supply them." Isidora opened her reticule, took out a folded sheet of paper, and laid it beside the lacquered card. It was a printed page, the 3rd edition of the same scandal sheet, the one already at the barber on Bond Street, the one that would be in every drawing-room by noon. "The 13th man," Aunt Lavinia read, aloud, without putting down her embroidery. "The most eligible bachelor in England has declined to be named upon the list. His Grace the Duke of Ashbourne has informed Sir Reginald Vane, through his secretary, that he does not propose to compete for the hand of any lady upon a printed slate, nor to bring a gift of any value within statutory limits, nor to court within the bounds of any rule devised for the convenience of fathers. He proposes, in fact, to refuse the entire business with the courtesy of a closed door. The lady will, no doubt, receive his refusal with the relief his absence affords." Lavinia paused. She set the needle down on her knee with great care. "Oh dear." "Yes." Aunt Lavinia laid the needle on the linen of the embroidery hoop. "That is, Isidora, that is very nearly an insult. It is precisely an insult. Or it is precisely the opposite of an insult. I have not decided which." Isidora set the paper down and pressed her palm flat against it. "If it is an insult, it is to my father for setting the list. If it is the opposite, it is to me for being on the list." Aunt Lavinia's voice was very quiet. "And the world will read it which way?" "The world will read it whichever way sells more copies of the next sheet." Lavinia took up the embroidery again. Her hand was steadier than the situation deserved. The fire in the grate cracked once. "And His Grace, you have met him?" "Once, last October, at the Whithorn ball. He was rude to a viscountess who deserved it, and kind to a footman who had spilled wine on the carpet, and he left before the dancing began. He looked at me twice. The first time, as though I were a problem he intended to solve later. The second time, as though he had already solved it and found the answer disagreeable. Aunt Lavinia's hand was still on the needle. Disagreeable how? She turned the teacup half a turn on the saucer. I cannot tell you. He did not speak to me. Aunt Lavinia took a careful stitch. And how would you describe him, my love, in your own words, not the sheets? Isadora thought about it. Tall, brown eyes. He wore an indigo coat that was a little too dark for the room. He had... She set down the cup. He had the manner of a man who has only one favorite chair in the world, and would rather sit in it than do almost anything else. And yet he has put himself on the front page of a scandal sheet for the sake of you. He has put himself on the front page for the sake of refusing the rules. That is not the same thing. My dear, Aunt Lavinia threaded the needle through the linen. It is not at all the same thing. But the world will not draw your distinction. She did not lift her eyes. And neither, I rather suspect, will your father. There was a noise in the corridor. The double doors of the morning room opened, with the kind of measured violence only a butler can manage, and so Reginald Vane came through them, with a printed sheet crumpled in one fist and the colour of a beetroot still high on his cheekbones. Out, he said to Aunt Lavinia, without looking at her. My dear Reginald, I have not finished my tea. His voice was very flat. Out, Lavinia. I shall take it with me. Aunt Lavinia rose, gathered her embroidery, gathered her cup, gathered, with her last shred of dignity, the unfinished slice of toast in the side plate, and walked from the room with the calm of a person who has watched the same play 3 times and knows precisely when to leave the stage. The double doors closed softly behind her. Sir Reginald slapped the crumpled sheet down on the table beside the lacquered card. Sir Reginald set both hands flat on the table. His knuckles were white. The candle in the sconce above his head guttered once and steadied. You will write to him, he said, and you will require him to come. Isadora set down her cup. The porcelain made a small, clean sound against the saucer. To come and do what, Papa? To come and stand in the parlour like the rest of them. To come and bring his gift. To come and take his hour. He cannot decline. He is a duke. She did not look at her father. She looked at the small gold smudge on the corner of the card. He has declined. Sir Reginald's hand closed on the back of the chair. The chair rocked once and was still. He has insulted me. He has insulted the printed slate, Papa. There is a distinction. You are not to draw distinctions for him, Isadora. You are not to draw distinctions for anyone. You are to be courteous. You are to be becoming. And at the end of June, you are to come down the staircase and name a name. He paused. His jaw worked once. A coal in the grate cracked. The plane trees in the square moved a little in the warm wind, and the name, Isadora, will not be his. She looked up. She set her teacup very carefully on the saucer. I thought, she said, I might choose. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The flat, clean syllables were enough. You will choose, said her father, from the list. That was the end of the breakfast. She sat in the empty morning room for some minutes after he had gone. The tea was cold in the cup. The toast had cooled to leather. The card still lay on the table, with the small gold smudge at its corner. From above came the resumption of the pacing. East, pause, west. Though it was, this morning, a little faster than usual, the way the rhythm of a clock spring goes a little faster when the case has been jolted. She thought about the Duke. She had thought about him, in some way or other, every day since October. She had been very careful not to admit the thinking to herself. She had filed it under other headings: interest in Regency politics, curiosity about Derbyshire, the question of whether brown eyes were less common than blue. And she had been, on the whole, successful in the filing. The card on the breakfast table had undone, in a single morning, 8 months of careful filing. The Duke was no longer filed. The Duke was sitting on top of the breakfast service, in print. There was no shelf in her head tidy enough to put him back on. She rose. She picked up the card. She carried it upstairs to her dressing room and laid it face down on the dressing table beside the silver-backed brush her mother had given her on her 16th birthday. Then she went to the window and looked out across the square, and she said aloud, to no one in particular, in the quiet, competent voice she used when she meant to make a plan. "Very well. 12, then. And the 13th. The window did not answer. The square did not answer. A pigeon on the sill ruffled its feathers and went on about its business. Sir Henry Aubrey Lisle came on Tuesday. The parlour had been prepared since 8. A fresh fire had been laid in the grate. 2 new candles in silver sticks stood on the chimney-piece in case the morning clouded over. The small sofa had been brushed. The cushions had been plumped. A tray of biscuits, almonds, and a decanter of weak Madeira stood on the side table. Aunt Lavinia, in a soft puce silk, had taken her seat in the corner by the window, with the embroidery hoop already in her lap. Sir Henry came in with the deliberate stride of a man who had practiced his entrance in a long glass. He bowed at the door. He bowed again at 3 paces. He sat down on the small sofa with a soft creak of springs, and arranged his coat-tails with the small particular care of a man arranging the verdict of his tailor. He brought a small enamelled snuff-box, containing no snuff, on the theory that a gentleman of fashion did not actually take snuff, but was obliged to be seen with the equipment of one. He spoke for the full hour, almost without pause, on the subject of his stables, his hounds, his cousin, who was nearly a marquis, and his own opinions about Italian opera, which he had not seen, but which he was confident he would not like if he did. Aunt Lavinia, in the corner, took 37 stitches, and did not once look up. When the hour was over, Sir Henry kissed Isadora's hand at a respectful distance, and informed her that he had enjoyed himself enormously. Isadora was not sure whether to envy him, or to send him a bill. The interview with Sir Henry concluded at the appointed time. The clock chimed. Sir Henry rose. He bowed thrice. He took his leave. The front door closed behind him. Isadora sat for some moments on the small sofa, with her hands folded in her lap, and the small enamelled snuff-box on the table beside her, and she watched the fire in the grate, and felt, in the silence, the soft, small weight of the room, close over the absence of him. Lord Petersmark came on Wednesday with a small ivory fan, which he presented as though it were the moon. He was a thin, anxious young man, with a thin, anxious laugh, and he spoke of his mother for 35 minutes of the hour. The remaining 25 he spent in nervous admiration of the wallpaper. At one point he asked Isadora whether she had any preferences with regard to the colour of curtains in a future drawing-room, and when she suggested peacock blue, his face did something so mournful that she found herself, against her will, adding, "Or perhaps a softer green," merely to spare him. Wednesday afternoon, in the garden of the square, Isadora walked a circuit and watched the soft April light move on the new leaves of the plane trees. A nursemaid passed, with a small boy in a sailor suit. The thrush in the laurel sang and stopped. A dog barked once, far off in some other square. She held the ivory fan in her gloved hand and opened it and shut it once and put it away. And she went back into the house, and did not think any more about Lord Petersmark, who had not, in her opinion, deserved the trouble of a future thought. Mr. Cassian Frost came on Thursday and was charming, which made him much more alarming than the other 2 combined. He was beautiful in the particular Frost way, black hair, grey eyes, a mouth that knew its own effect, and he wore a coat of deep saffron silk that managed to look entirely natural on him. He spoke in the soft, intimate register of a man who has practiced intimacy with strangers. He asked Isadora 3 questions, each better than the last, listened to her answers as though they were the most fascinating thing he had heard that month, and within 40 minutes had drawn from her an admission that she had once, when very young, tried to teach the kitchen cat to read. "And did it learn?" he said. "It declined the lesson." "A cat of taste," he smiled. "And you, Miss Vane, do you also decline lessons?" Only the badly taught ones. Then I must take pains, he said softly, to teach you well. Aunt Lavinia took a stitch with such precision that Isadora heard the snap of the thread. When Mr. Frost had gone, Lavinia laid the embroidery in her lap and said, without looking at her niece, Lavinia's voice was quiet, but it was the quiet of iron. He is a snake. Isadora pressed her palm against the cool linen of the tablecloth. He was very pleasant. He is a very pleasant snake. They are the worst kind. Lavinia took up the needle again. The fire in the grate cracked softly. Do not tell your father I said so. He admires the family. Mr. Frost sent flowers the next morning, saffron roses, in a porcelain bowl, beautifully arranged. The note pinned to them was a single line in a soft, sloping hand. The cat would have learned for me. Isadora set the note in the fire and watched the corner curl black before she looked away. The roses themselves she carried, herself, to the back stairs and gave to the under-housemaid for the servants' parlour. The girl took them with a small surprised curtsy and a flush at her throat, and Isadora thought, on the way back up the carpeted stairs, that the maid had perhaps been the only person in the entire transaction who had any honest pleasure of the flowers. The roses had cost Mr. Frost considerable thought. They had cost Isadora some small effort of suppression. They had brightened, in the end, only the small back parlour where cook took her tea. There was, she thought, a moral somewhere in the journey of the roses, and she would, in better light, attempt to extract it. Friday morning the weather turned. A soft, warm rain fell over the square. The plane trees shone. The smell of the city changed at once from coal smoke to wet leaves and damp stone. The parlour had to be lit even at 11, and the small fire in the grate burned bright against the grey light from the window. The Earl of Whithorn came on Friday, ate 2 plates of biscuits, asked twice whether dinner would be served, and left after 50 minutes for an appointment at his bootmaker. Saturday was bright. The rain had cleared. The plane trees in the square were soft and full and clean. Mr. Mortimer Castle came on Saturday and quoted Pliny. Sunday, Isadora went to church with her father and her aunt. The morning was fine. The bells of 3 steeples rang at once over the rooftops. She sat in the family pew. She listened to a sermon on patience, which she found, in the circumstances, more apt than the curate had perhaps intended. She walked home through the square, with her hand on her father's arm, and found, in all the walk together, nothing she could think to say. The Viscount Dereham came on Monday following, and spoke entirely of his mother's pug. Sir Bertram Quill came and recited a poem he had written about Isadora's eyes, which were grey, but which he had decided in his poem to call the colour of the sea, which would have been more flattering if he had ever actually seen the sea. He read the poem aloud twice. He had written it in pencil on the back of a music sheet. The pencil had smudged in 2 places, where his thumb had rested while he read. Aunt Lavinia, in the corner, took her stitches with the small, steady precision of a metronome, and at the end of the second reading, lifted her eyes once, very briefly, to the wallpaper above Sir Bertram's left ear, and let the eyes rest there for a long moment, and then returned them to her embroidery without a word. By the end of the second week, 6 of the 12 had presented themselves, and 6 were still to come, and Isadora had begun to feel that the parlour was a small, dim room at the bottom of a very long well, and that her father, leaning over the lip of the well above, was lowering down men on ropes at hourly intervals. The parlour itself had begun to acquire, in her private estimation, the slight stale smell that small rooms take on when too many strangers have been kept in them too long. The cushions on the small sofa had grown a little flat. The carpet by the fire had a faint scuff in it from Sir Henry's restless boot. The clock on the chimney-piece, which had once been merely a clock, had become an instrument of torture. Every quarter hour it chimed, and every chime moved a stranger 1 position nearer to the door, and every chime moved the next stranger 1 position nearer along the corridor. She had taken, in those 2 weeks, to walking in the garden of the square for half an hour after each interview. The plane trees were in their soft new leaf. The grass under them was thin and patchy from the winter, and a thrush, in the same low laurel each afternoon, sang a few clear notes and stopped, as though the song had been begun by another bird and abandoned. Isadora had grown unaccountably fond of the thrush. She liked, she thought, any creature who began something and abandoned it. It was, she had begun to see, the rarer kind of courage. The card, by now, had been read in every drawing room from Cavendish Square to Belgrave. The scandal sheet had reprinted it twice. The Duke of Ashbourne's refusal had been reprinted 4 times. The wagering book at White's had, by mid-April, 3 columns. The names of the 12, the odds on each, and a separate column under the heading, The 13th, with the question, will he come? The odds in that column began at 8-1 against, and shortened week by week as the world refused to forget him. He did not come. The not coming was, in its way, a louder presence than any coming could have been. Every drawing room she entered, every dinner she sat through, every box at the opera, every long, polite carriage ride to Hyde Park at the fashionable hour, every event was full of the place where he was not. The chair he might have taken stood empty in 3 drawing rooms a week. The hand he did not write was the hand the Morning Post in the silver salver did not contain. The door he did not enter was the door the butler did not announce. He sent no letter. He did not appear at the Castlereagh ball, where everyone, including Isadora's slowest aunt, was certain he would appear. He did not stand at the back of the opera at Covent Garden, where every woman in the house turned twice during the second act to be sure. He was not seen in the park at the fashionable hour, nor in any of the clubs at any hour, nor at any of the suppers to which any of the 12 had also been invited. He had taken himself out of the world for the duration of the list, as if to make clear that his refusal was not a tactic. Aunt Lavinia, by the 3rd week, had begun to say that this was even more interesting than if he had come. "He is letting the rules ruin themselves," she said one evening, by the fire, while Isadora stared at the embroidery without seeing it. "That is a remarkable economy of effort. Most men would have to push. He is being rude. He is being absent, which is a different vice. It is the same vice, dressed better. My dear, that is the only kind of vice that ever ends up in a duchy." Lavinia took a stitch. "I do not say I approve. I do say I am paying attention." The 4th week of the list arrived on a Monday of soft rain. The plane trees in the square were heavy with new green. The cobbles on the avenue shone wet. The smell of the city changed, as it does in late spring, from coal smoke to damp leaves and warm bread. And Isadora, dressing herself before the long glass in her bedroom, paused, with the pearl half fastened at her throat, and noticed, as if at a great distance, that the face in the glass had grown a little thinner in 3 weeks. The grey eyes were the same. The mouth was a little quieter than it had been in March. The hands that fastened the pearl were as steady as they had ever been. But there was a small, grave look about the face that she did not entirely recognize, and that, she suspected, no one but herself would have noticed. It was in the 4th week that Isadora met him. She had gone, on a Tuesday morning, to the lending library on Cavendish Square. It was the one form of escape her father had not yet thought to forbid, partly because he had not yet considered that his daughter might want one. The morning was warm, the cobbles of the square shone. The brass plate on the library door had been freshly polished and caught the sun like a small, bright disk. The lilac in the area railings of the house next door was in full flower, and the smell of it came soft on the air. She'd asked Bartlett, the coachman, to put her down at the corner and wait at the end of the street, and she had walked the last 2 doors herself, with her bonnet pulled forward, and her face turned away from the window of the milliner's. The library at that hour was almost empty. A clerk was dusting. A grey gentleman was asleep over a volume of sermons. The morning sun fell in long, pale rectangles across the carpet between the shelves. She had gone to the back, to the fiction, where the better novels lived. She had taken down a slim volume of poems and was reading the page of contents, when a voice behind her, quiet and almost amused, said, "Miss Vane." She turned. She did not drop the book. That, afterwards, she counted as a small and necessary victory. The Duke of Ashbourne stood 3 paces away, in an indigo greatcoat that was a little too dark for the morning, with his hat in one hand and a book in the other. He was, as she remembered, tall, too tall, in the close confines of the shelves, so that he had stooped a little to look at her without seeming to loom. His brown eyes were quite still. He held his hat at his side. "Your Grace?" He inclined his head a fraction. He did not move closer. "Forgive me. I had not expected to find you here." She kept her hand steady on the slim volume of poems. "And yet you knew my name." His mouth moved at the corner. It was not quite a smile. "I have read it in 3 sheets this morning. It would be difficult, by now, not to know it." She lifted her chin a fraction. The slim volume of poems was warm under her fingers. "And I have read yours." "Then we are equally at a disadvantage." He hesitated. "I wished to write. My secretary told me I should not. I told my secretary that he could not always be correct. He was correct that morning." "You will not write to me?" "I will not write to you while your father has a list. To write would be to enter the list. I have promised, in a printed sheet, not to enter the list. I keep small promises better than large ones." He glanced at the book in her hands. "What are you reading?" She turned the slim volume over in her hand. The cloth of the cover was soft, and a little frayed at one corner. "I have not yet decided. It is poems." His head inclined a fraction. "Whose?" She felt the small, steady tap of her own pulse at the inside of her wrist where her glove ended. "It does not signify. I came in chiefly to be elsewhere." His mouth moved at the corner. "Then I have spoiled it." She held his gaze. "You have made it interesting. That is different." He looked at her then for what felt to her like the first time, though it was, by the strict accounting of the morning, the third. His face was not the face of the scandal sheet. The scandal sheet had drawn him as a man of cold pride. This man was tired. His hair was a little out of order. There were faint shadows under his eyes. He looked like a man who had not slept well, and who, for reasons of his own, would not admit it to anyone, including himself. "Miss Vane," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, and I find that I am not able to give it in any of the rooms in which it would be heard. I cannot call upon you. I cannot write. I refused both in print, before I had thought what either of them would cost you. If you wish me to come and stand in your father's parlour, and bring my £20 gift and take my hour, you have only to send word and I will come. I will be late. I will be ungracious. I will be every inch the bore the sheets describe me. But I will come." A faint warmth rose along her throat. "You would?" "Yes." "And bring your gift?" "Within the statutory limit." "And take your hour?" "And not a minute over." "And at the end of June, when I am to come down the staircase and name a name, would I be at liberty then to name yours?" He held the book very still. "You would be at liberty. I do not flatter myself that you would do it." She kept her hands quite still on the volume of poems. "Why would I not?" "Because to do it would be to permit the list to have meant anything. And the list is the thing I refuse." He looked at her then, very level. "I refuse it for you, Miss Vane, as much as for me. If I take my hour, your father wins. If you choose me at the foot of his staircase, the world will say he was right to have set the staircase up." He paused. "I would rather, on the whole, that the world said he was wrong." She drew a breath. "That is a great deal," she said, "to refuse on my behalf, without asking me." "Yes," he said, "it is. I am sorry. That is the apology I came to give." The grey gentleman over the sermons stirred and turned a page. The clerk's duster scratched on a far shelf. Somewhere in the street a barrow rattled past, and a child laughed. "Your Grace," she said. "I would like to ask you a question." "Ask." "If the list did not exist, if my father had not set out his 12, would you have called?" He thought about it. He did not pretend to think. He actually thought, with his eyes on the carpet between them, for what felt like a long moment. "I had intended to," he said at last. "In October. I had decided in October. I went to the Whithorn ball with the intention of asking your aunt for permission to call. I lost my nerve at the door of the ballroom." She watched his face. "Why?" "Because I am a duke, Miss Vane, and a duke who calls upon a girl in October is a duke who has chosen her in October. And I had not the courage, at that hour, to be sure of myself for both of us." He almost smiled. The almost smile did something to his mouth that she had not yet learned, at that hour, how to read. "Then your father printed his list, and the matter was decided for me. I could not call without joining the auction." "And so you refused the auction?" "And so I refused the auction." The sunlight between them moved a handbreadth on the carpet as a cloud passed. "And now?" "And now," he said, "I am the man who stands in a library and apologizes, and goes away. There is, I think, no other thing for me to be." She did not answer for a moment. She looked down at the slim volume of poems in her hands. She looked up. "Will you," she said, "recommend me a book?" He blinked. Then, in a voice so quiet she felt it more than heard it, he said, "I would be honored." He set down his hat. He came 1 pace closer, not 2. He took from a high shelf a small octavo bound in green calf, with a worn gilt spine. He held it out to her without flourish. "It is a translation," he said, "from the Italian. Sonnets. I have read it twice. The second time was better than the first." "And the third?" "I have not yet earned the third." She took the book. Their fingers did not touch. He had been careful that they would not. The careful absence of the touch was, in its way, louder than the touch would have been. "Miss Vane." "Your Grace." He did not bow. He inclined his head, very slightly, in a way that was, for a man of his rank, the equivalent of a deep obeisance. He picked up his hat. He walked the length of the carpet between the shelves and out into the morning, and the door of the library closed behind him, with the small, deliberate sound of a man who closes a door because he has the discipline not to slam it. Isadora stood for some moments in the soft sunlight between the shelves, with a slim volume of poems in one hand and a small octavo bound in green calf in the other, and the silence of the room around her like a held breath. Then she went to the desk and said, in her ordinary voice, "I should like to borrow this one, please." And she paid the fee, and she walked out into the street with the book under her arm and her bonnet pulled forward, and she did not look in either direction along Cavendish Square. She did not tell Aunt Lavinia about the library that evening. She did not tell her father. She put the small octavo on the table beside her bed, between a glass of water and a candle stub, and she lay awake for a long time, looking at the worn gilt of its spine, and thinking, very slowly, about the careful absence of the touch. The house, after midnight, was quieter than she had thought a house in London could be. A carriage went by once at the end of the street. A cat cried somewhere on a wall. The candle stub guttered low, then steadied, then guttered again, and the small worn gilt of the green calf spine caught the light each time the flame moved. She thought of his face in the soft sunlight between the shelves. She thought of the indigo greatcoat, but was a little too dark for the morning. She thought of the small, dry voice in which he had said, very quietly, "I would be honored." She thought, also, of the fact that he had been careful not to touch her fingers when he handed her the book. The careful avoidance was, she understood now, the most particular gesture a man of his rank and discipline could make. He had made it in the small back of a public library, where no one was watching but a sleeping gentleman and a clerk with a duster, and he had made it for her benefit. and not for the rooms. It was a gesture that no scandal sheet would ever print, because no scandal sheet would ever know it had occurred. The world would not give him credit for it. The world would never give him credit for any of it. Only she would know, and she would know for the rest of her life. And that, she thought, as the candle stub guttered out and the room went dark, was a particular kind of compensation for which she had not, before this morning, ever been in the market. In the days that followed, the parlour filled and emptied at hourly intervals like a tide. The weather grew warmer. The plane trees in the square thickened into full leaf. The smell of the city sharpened. Coal smoke, horse, hot stone, the warm dust of carpets beaten in the area yards of half the houses on the street. London in late April smelled of all of itself at once, and Isadora, going from parlour to garden to morning room to dressing room and back to parlour again, carried the smell of it on her skirts wherever she went. She had begun to dream, at night, of the green calf spine of the small octavo. She did not dream of the Duke himself. She dreamed of the book, and the careful absence of the touch, and the soft, sloping copperplate of the note she had not yet sent. The dreams were quiet, and they were lucid, and they left no headache in the morning, only a small, steady ache somewhere behind her breastbone that she had learned to carry around the house with her without remarking on it. Mr. Augustus Pell came and explained the principles of crop rotation. Colonel Hayde came and explained the principles of cavalry. Lord Felton Marchby came with a sapphire pin worth £17, presented it with no ceremony, and spent the remaining 58 minutes of his hour describing a horse he had once owned in Kildare. Mr. Silas Underwood came and was so silent that Aunt Lavinia, by the end of the hour, was leaning forward in her chair with the embroidery in her lap forgotten, willing him, by sheer force of expectation, to produce a sentence. He did not. He left at the appointed time, bowed, and went away, having communicated, in the course of his hour, 3 observations about the weather and 1 about the upholstery. After Mr. Underwood, Aunt Lavinia rose from her corner, laid the embroidery aside with care, and walked the length of the parlour to the bell pull. She tugged it once, with great precision. Then she sat down on the sofa beside Isadora, gathered her skirts, and pressed the back of her cool, dry hand once to her niece's wrist. "My love," she said, "we shall have some tea, with sugar, and the seed cake. We are going to require sugar." The tea, when it came, was the colour of old amber, and the seed cake was warm and faintly sweet, and the maid had remembered the lemon. Isadora drank 2 cups in silence. The fire in the grate burned low and steady. The clock on the chimney-piece ticked the long, slow afternoon away. Outside in the square, somewhere, a child was crying for a kite, and the kite, by the sound of it, had gone into a tree, and a footman in livery was being dispatched, by the sound of it, to climb up after it. The world, again, went on with its business. Isadora drank her tea. The small, steady ache behind her breastbone held its precise, quiet weight. Mr. Edmund Lovelace, the youngest of the 12, came last in the first cycle. He was 23, fair, with eyes the colour of cornflowers, and he sat at the edge of his chair as though it might bite him. He brought no gift at all. When Isadora pointed out, gently, that he was permitted £20, he flushed to the roots of his hair. I had a gift," he said. "It is at home. I forgot it on the hall table. I rode here in such a state of... I forgot it." "What was it?" "A book, of botanical drawings. My sister chose it. She said it was the kind of book a lady might like." He looked at the carpet. "Forgive me. You may bring it next time." "There is to be a next time?" "There are to be 12 next times, Mr. Lovelace. There are rules." He nodded miserably and stared at the carpet, and spoke for the rest of the hour, in a low and stumbling voice, about a hedgerow on his father's estate, where, in the right week of June, the wild roses opened all at once, and the hedge for 2 days together was nothing but white. Aunt Lavinia, in the corner, took 20 stitches without looking down. When he was gone, Lavinia said, "That one is too young, my love. He is a boy. He is the kindest of them. Kindness is not enough. He cannot stand up to your father for 10 minutes together. None of them can. That, said Lavinia, is rather the difficulty, is it not? The difficulty, in the 5th week, sharpened. Mr. Cassian Frost, having taken his first hour with charm, took his second with something quieter and more dangerous. He brought no gift at all. He sat in the parlour with his beautiful saffron coat and his beautiful grey eyes and his beautiful soft voice, and he spoke about a small estate of his in Hertfordshire, a stone house, a walled garden, a particular tree under which, he said, he meant to plant a particular bench for a particular wife to sit on, with a particular book. He described the house with such care that Isadora, who had a clear inner eye, could see the bench, the tree, the wife in her summer gown. He waited until Aunt Lavinia had bent very low over a difficult stitch, and then he leaned, just a little, toward Isadora across the small table, and he said, in the soft, sloping voice of his note, "I know about the library." She did not move. She did not allow her face to change. She set down her cup with a steady hand and said, "I beg your pardon, Mr. Frost." The library on Cavendish Square. The morning of the 11th. The slim volume of poems on the table beside your bed. The octavo bound in green calf. The colour left her face. It came back at once, in a hot, bright rush across her cheekbones and along her throat. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Of course you do. So do I. So does the man I paid, on the Tuesday afternoon, to follow your carriage to the corner. So does the maid I paid, on the Wednesday morning, to look in your dressing room. So, by Friday, will any sheet that pays me for the story." He smiled gently. "I do not propose to sell the story. I propose to keep it. I propose to be the man who keeps it. Your father has set out 12 names. He has set out rules. I propose to be the man inside the rules who can hold the rules. Choose me at the foot of the staircase on Midsummer, Miss Vane, and the story will never leave my mouth. Choose any other, and it will be in print by breakfast." Aunt Lavinia took her stitch. She did not look up. She did not move. The fire in the grate burned low. The clock on the chimney-piece ticked once, very precisely, into the silence. "Mr. Frost," said Isadora, in a voice she did not entirely recognize as her own, "your hour is not yet over. I will, however, ring." His soft, sloping voice did not change. The grey eyes did not change either. "You will not ring." She set her hands flat on her knees under the table. "I will." "You will not. Because if you ring, the maid who comes to the door will be the maid I have already paid, and she will see in your face that I've spoken, and the story will leave the house tonight in any case. Ring, if you like. I am quite content to be turned out, and to be the man who turned the key." There was a small, terrible silence in the parlour. The fire popped in the grate. A coal fell. Aunt Lavinia's needle paused, then resumed. "Mr. Frost," said Aunt Lavinia, without lifting her eyes, "did you say you had no gift for my niece today?" I beg your pardon, madam." "You brought no gift. The rule is £20. You brought nothing. That is a breach of the rules of the list. I shall mention it to my brother." She took a stitch. "And I shall mention also that you spent the second half of your hour in conversation with me on the subject of the gardens at Chiswick. Did we not, Mr. Frost, speak at considerable length about the gardens at Chiswick?" He looked at her. Slowly the saffron beauty of his face arranged itself into something close to admiration. "We did, madam," he said. "I thought so. My memory upon such things is excellent. My memory on conversations that did not take place is even better. I should not, were I you, propose to call again." She took another stitch. "And the maid you have paid, Mr. Frost, is the maid I dismissed on Monday for the very fault you describe? She is no longer in this house. She will be glad of your shilling, but it will not buy you what you supposed it would buy you." For a long moment he stood quite still. Then he rose. He bowed, very correctly, to Isadora. Miss Vane. Mr. Frost. He walked out of the parlour with the calm of a man who has lost only the first move of a long game and is not yet inclined to mind. The door closed. Aunt Lavinia laid her embroidery down in her lap. "My love," she said, very quietly. "Is there a small octavo, bound in green calf, on the table beside your bed?" "Yes." "And on what morning, my dear, were you in the library at Cavendish Square?" "On the 11th. "And alone?" "Not entirely." Lavinia closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, her face was the face of a woman who had reached, late in life, a decision she had been postponing for years. "My dear," she said, "we are going to have to be very clever, you and I. Your father cannot help us. He is not clever in the manner that this requires. He is loud, and he is proud, and he means well, and he is going to make everything worse." She took up the needle again. "I shall tell him, this evening, that the maid I dismissed on Monday took a packet of letters with her, and that I have engaged a new maid from a country agency, and that nothing of consequence has occurred. I shall be entirely calm. He will believe me, because I am, in his eyes, a foolish person, and a foolish person who is calm is the most reassuring sight in the world to a worried man." She glanced at Isadora. "And you, my love, will write a note." "To whom?" "To His Grace the Duke of Ashbourne. You will not ask him to come. You will not ask him to call. You will tell him, in 3 lines, that Mr. Cassian Frost has spoken of the library on Cavendish Square, in the parlour of Vane House this morning, and that you are uncertain how long the story may keep. You will tell him nothing more. You will sign it I, and you will send it by the underfootman, who is loyal to me, and who can be trusted to put it into the hand of His Grace's secretary, and not into the hand of any sheet. And then? And then we wait. For what? For what he does. And if he does nothing? Then, said Aunt Lavinia, taking a careful stitch, we shall have learned something useful about him before midsummer, which is more than your father will have learned in 3 months. Isadora wrote the note. She wrote it in her own hand. She sealed it with plain wax and no crest. She gave it to the underfootman, who took it without a word, and she watched him go out of the back gate into the mews. And she stood for a long moment at the window, with her forehead against the cool glass, and thought, very carefully, about the careful absence of the touch. The Duke did not write back. He came. The morning was bright and warm. The plane trees in the square moved a little in the breeze. A milk cart was at the corner. A grey pigeon stalked the railings of the area. The air smelled of warm stone, and a faint sweetness of lilac from someone's window box. He came at 9 the following morning, which was not an hour at which gentlemen called, and he came alone, on horseback, and he came up the front steps of Vane House 2 at a time, and he came into the hall with his hat in one hand and his riding gloves in the other, and his indigo greatcoat unbuttoned, and he said to the butler, in a voice so quiet and so absolute that the butler did not even consider arguing, "I am here to see Sir Reginald Vane." He did not ask for Isadora. He did not ask for Aunt Lavinia. He walked, without waiting to be announced, across the hall and up the great staircase to the door of Sir Reginald's study, and he knocked once, and he went in, and he closed the door behind him. Isadora and Aunt Lavinia were in the morning room. They heard the knock. They heard the door close. The morning room felt suddenly very small. The fire in the grate burned low. The clock on the chimney-piece ticked softly. A coal shifted. The smell of bergamot from the cooling teapot was thin in the air. Aunt Lavinia's needle moved through the linen with the small, steady precision of a metronome, and Isadora, sitting opposite her, found that she had pressed her palms flat against the velvet of the sofa arm without remembering when she had done it. They heard, after a long silence, the rise and fall of 2 voices through the wall. The words themselves never reached them. They heard, at one point, Sir Reginald's voice rise into something close to a shout, and they heard, in response, A single, short, quiet sentence from the Duke that did the work of a closing door. After 30 minutes, the study door opened. The Duke walked down the great staircase. He did not look into the morning room. He did not look at anything but the front door. The butler opened it. He went out into the street, and the butler closed the door behind him, and the hall returned to silence. A few moments later, Sir Reginald himself came to the morning room. His colour was very high. His mouth was a thin line. He stood in the doorway and looked at Isadora and at Aunt Lavinia, and he said, in a voice that was almost steady, "There will be no further interview with Mr. Frost." Isadora rose half from her chair. "Papa?" "Mr. Cassian Frost is removed from the list. He has, I'm informed, accepted a diplomatic posting in Lisbon. He sails on Friday." Sir Reginald paused. He looked, for the first time in many weeks, like a man who was not entirely sure of his own footing in the world. "His Grace the Duke of Ashbourne has been pleased to point out to me that the gentleman concerned was an unsuitable candidate for the hand of my daughter. His Grace has been very persuasive." She kept her voice steady.
"What did he say, Papa?"
"He said," said Sir Reginald slowly, "that he would lay before me this afternoon, in a private interview with my solicitor, a packet of papers concerning Mr. Frost's conduct in Brighton in the summer of '13, which would, if read, oblige me to remove the gentleman from any list of any kind for the remainder of my life. He said that he had no intention of laying the papers before any sheet, nor before any club, nor before any other person living. He said he had brought them because he had no other lever to hand, and he would rather use a clean lever than a dirty one. He said that having used the lever, he would consider his obligation in the matter discharged." Sir Reginald looked at the carpet. "And he said, Isadora, that he understood he was not entitled to interfere in the affair of my list, and that he begged my pardon for doing so, and that it would not be repeated."
"Papa."
Sir Reginald's voice was a little hoarse.
"He said one other thing."
She watched his face.
"Yes, Papa?"
Sir Reginald looked at his hands. He said he had not enjoyed the conversation. Sir Reginald sat down in the chair by the fire. His hands rested on his knees. He looked, in the soft morning light, like a smaller man than the one who had set out the list. "I do not know," he said, after a long moment, "what to do with a duke who refuses my list, and then defends my list. The two things do not. They do not." He shook his head. "I do not understand him, Isadora."
"No, Papa."
"And I do not understand," he said, more quietly, "what kind of man I have asked you to choose, that he could be so easily what he was, and so easily not be it." Isadora set down her teacup. She crossed the room. She knelt by her father's chair and laid her hand on the back of his. For a moment he sat absolutely still. Then he turned his hand over and held hers very tightly.
"Papa."
The colour at his cheekbones had faded.
"I have been a fool, my dear."
She knelt by his chair.
"Not entirely, Papa."
"Largely." The fire cracked again.
"Largely, then."
He laughed. It was a small laugh, and it was not at all a happy one, but it was the first laugh Isadora had heard from him in 7 weeks. "There is still a list."
"Yes, Papa, there is still a list."
"It has 11 names on it."
"Yes, Papa."
"And His Grace is still not upon it."
"No, Papa."
"Then on the morning of midsummer," said Sir Reginald, with a kind of slow incredulity at his own words, "you will still be obliged to choose from the list. You will still be obliged to come down the staircase. The world will still be watching. The sheets will still be printing. It is too late, Isadora. It is too late for me to undo what I have done. The list is out."
"I know, Papa."
And if you choose one of the 11 you do not care for, you will not forgive me.
No, Papa.
And if you do not choose at all, he said, very quietly, the world will say I have failed at the only matter to which I set my hand. And he closed his eyes. I have not the strength for that, my dear. I am not so brave as you suppose. She knelt by his chair a long moment. Aunt Lavinia, in the corner, had taken up the embroidery again, with the small and almost invisible movement of a person who wishes very much not to be present, and is also unwilling to leave.
Papa,
said Isadora at last,
let me think about it.
There is not time to think about it. Midsummer is in 18 days.
Then I shall think quickly.
He laughed again, and this time it was a more honest laugh, and he raised her hand and laid the back of it briefly against his cheek, and he said, You were always the better Vane, my love. I should have known it from the cradle. I do not know why I did not. After he had gone, Aunt Lavinia, without looking up from the embroidery, said,
My dear, Aunt, you are going to have to do something rather frightening.
Yes, Aunt.
And the something is not what your father supposes.
No, Aunt.
And it is not, I think, what His Grace supposes either.
No, Aunt. Not entirely.
Then I suggest,
said Aunt Lavinia, taking a careful stitch,
that we send for the underfootman, and the underfootman, this time, will take a longer note.
That afternoon, Isadora wrote the longer note. She did not show it to Aunt Lavinia. She sealed it with plain wax and no crest. She sent it by the underfootman. No word came that afternoon. She wrote a list of household matters and could not concentrate on them. She walked twice round the garden of the square and noticed neither the thrush nor the lilac. She sat at the pianoforte in the long drawing room for an hour and played the same 8 bars of a Mozart andante over and over until the under-housemaid came in to lay the fire and gave her a look of such kind and tactful pity that Isadora rose at once and closed the lid of the instrument. No word came that evening. Dinner was a silent affair. Sir Reginald, opposite her, ate with the slow, careful motions of a man who was not, on the whole, hungry, but who had not given himself permission to admit it. Aunt Lavinia, at the foot of the table, kept up a small, bright thread of conversation about a neighbour's new bonnet and a charity bazaar in Hanover Square and the price of asparagus, and the long, polite silences in between were filled by the soft chiming of cutlery against porcelain and the quiet tread of the underfootman on the carpet. By the second morning she had not heard back, and a small, frightened space had opened up under her ribs that no amount of careful thinking could close. She lay in bed until 8, which was not her habit. The light through the white muslin curtain was bright and warm. A blackbird in the garden of the square sang a long, liquid phrase, and stopped, and sang it again, and stopped, and the small, frightened space under her ribs held its same precise weight on either repetition. By the second evening, she had begun to imagine, in the soft, idle, dangerous way that is the chief vice of waiting, what it would be like to live in a stone house with a walled garden and a particular bench under a particular tree, if the bench were the right one. She was annoyed with herself for the picture. The annoyance did not make the picture go away. She saw, in the picture, a tall sash window with a deep stone sill. She saw soft, warm, honey-coloured stone walls. She saw a long bookcase of dark wood with a faint smell of beeswax and old leather. She saw, on the bench under the tree, a small square of warm sun, and a book left open face down on the seat by someone who would, in a moment, come back to it. The picture, like the blackbird, repeated itself and stopped, and repeated itself again. On the third morning, Aunt Lavinia came into the breakfast room with a small folded paper in her hand. No seal, no crest. The handwriting unmistakable.
From the library,
said Aunt Lavinia dryly. The under-footman is becoming quite fond of the librarian. He says she gave him a biscuit. Isadora opened the paper. There were 3 lines. Cavendish Square, Thursday at 10.
The same shelf. There is a thing I should like to say, and I find that I have no other room in which I am permitted to say it. A. She read it 3 times. She folded it again. She set it on the table beside her cup. She kept her eyes on the folded paper instead of meeting Aunt Lavinia's gaze, because if she looked at Aunt Lavinia, she would do something undignified, and Aunt Lavinia would look back at her with the kind face of a person who had seen this particular undignified thing before in her own life, and had taken the trouble, ever after, to be discreet about it. The egg cup on the breakfast table was painted with a small blue forget-me-not. The toast in the rack was warm, and the butter in the small glass dish was beginning, in the bright morning warmth, to soften at one edge. The teapot steamed gently. The under-housemaid passed in the corridor with a soft tread. Isadora pressed her palm flat against the table and felt the cool of the linen and the warmth of the toast rack and the small, steady tap of her own pulse in her wrist. "My dear," said Aunt Lavinia, "eat your egg." "I am not hungry." "Eat it anyway. It will steady you. There is nothing that the small, careful business of an egg cannot steady in a person of sense." Isadora ate her egg. Wednesday passed in a blur of small, unremembered tasks. She wrote 3 letters and could not afterwards have said to whom. She had her hair done. She sat for an hour in the long drawing room with a book of poems open on her lap and read the same sonnet 7 times before realizing she had not understood a single line. Aunt Lavinia, in her usual chair, took stitches with the small, steady precision of a metronome and let the whole afternoon pass without asking a single question. Thursday, at 10, she stood once again in the back of the library on Cavendish Square. The morning was warmer than it had been in April. The sun fell through the high windows in long, pale rectangles across the carpet between the shelves. The grey gentleman was again asleep over the same volume of sermons, as though he had not moved in 3 weeks. The clerk was dusting a different shelf. The slim volume of poems she had borrowed sat in her reticule, ready to be returned. The small octavo, bound in green calf, sat at home on her table, between a glass of water and a candle stub, where it had sat every night for 3 weeks. He came in at 10 precisely. He saw her at the back of the room. He walked the length of the carpet between the shelves with his hat in one hand and his book in the other. He stopped 1 pace from her, with the hat steady at his side. "Miss Vane." "Your Grace?" "I have come," he said, "to say a thing that is true and inconvenient. I find that I would prefer to say it badly than not at all, because if I do not say it, I shall spend a great many years wishing I had, and I would rather spend the years in some other occupation." "Yes?" He looked at the carpet for a moment. He looked up. His brown eyes were quite still. "I love you, Miss Vane," he said. "I have loved you, I think, since October, when I lost my nerve at the door of the Whithorn ball. I do not know yet whether you have any feeling for me, but I do not propose to leave the question to a printed list at the foot of a staircase on midsummer morning." He drew a breath. The pulse at his throat moved once, very visibly, above the white linen of his cravat. "I shall not call upon you in your father's parlour. I shall not bring a gift within statutory limits. I shall not take an hour by the clock. I shall ask, instead, whether you will come away with me on the morning of midsummer, before you are obliged to come down the staircase, and marry me, by special license, at St. James's at 9:30, with your aunt for witness if she will come, and a curate for officiant, and the world afterwards may write what it likes." His voice was very level. His brown eyes were very steady. The hand that held the small book trembled once, and then was still. "I have a stone house in Derbyshire, and a small library in it that wants a reader. I have an aunt of my own who is quite as alarming as yours, and who, I believe, will love you on sight. I have, I am told, a tolerable horse, and a tolerable temper, and a face which, I am informed, is not unpleasant in candlelight. I have nothing else to recommend me but the wish, and the wish, I am afraid, is very strong." For a long moment she was silent. "Your Grace." "Adrian. Adrian." The word felt small in her mouth, and absolutely right. The grey eyes met the brown. "I have a question." "Ask." "If I do not come away with you on the morning of midsummer, if I come down the staircase as my father wishes, and choose one of the 11, or choose none of them, what then?" He looked at her steadily. "Then I shall be in the chapel at St. James's at 9:30, with the curate, with no bride, and with the discipline not to leave until 10, in case you change your mind in the carriage. At 10, I shall walk out into the street, and I shall ride north, and I shall live, I hope, a tolerable life. I shall not blame you. I shall not write to you again. I shall be very careful, as long as you live, to give you no more trouble than I have already given you." He paused. "I do not propose this as a trap. I propose it as the only door I can open without going through your father's house. If you will not come through it, I shall close it gently behind me and lock it from the other side. The closing of the door, I promise you, will make no sound." "And the careful absence of the touch?" He smiled then, for the first time, with the corner of his mouth. "The careful absence of the touch," he said, "is the only kind of touch I have permitted myself to think of, Miss Vane, for these 8 weeks together. I have been very disciplined. I have, I am informed by my secretary, become extremely difficult to live with. Your secretary is to be pitied. He is paid handsomely. Even so. Even so." He looked at her. "Will you come?" She thought about it. She did not pretend to think. She actually thought, with her eyes on the carpet between them, for what felt to her like a long moment. The grey gentleman over the sermons stirred and turned a page. The clerk's duster scratched on a far shelf. Somewhere in the street a barrow rattled past, and a child laughed, and the same morning came in through the same high windows, and fell in the same pale rectangles on the carpet, between the shelves where it had fallen 3 weeks before. "Adrian," she said. "Yet. On the morning of midsummer, at 9:30, I shall be at St. James's." He closed his eyes. He opened them again. He let, this time, the discipline of not smiling go, and the smile, when it came, was the smile of a man who has been holding his breath for 8 weeks, and has at last been told he may set it down. "Miss Vane." "Isadora." "Isadora." He repeated it once, softly, as though tasting the word. "I have nothing in this room that is worthy of the moment, and I will not steal a kiss in a public library, because it would be the kind of theft for which I have lectured other men. I shall, however, with your permission," he held out his hand, palm up, "shake your hand, like a tradesman closing a bargain. It is the most romantic gesture I can manage in the available shelves." She put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, very warm, very steady. He did not press. He did not hold a moment longer than the gesture required. He let her go. It was, by any honest measure, the most particular handshake of her life. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday." He walked the length of the carpet between the shelves and out into the morning, and the door of the library closed behind him with the small, deliberate sound of a man who closes a door because he has the discipline not to slam it. She stood for a moment in the soft sunlight between the shelves. She returned the slim volume of poems to the desk. She paid no fee, because there was none to pay. She walked out into Cavendish Square with her bonnet pulled forward and her face turned away from no one in particular, and she did not look in either direction along the street. She had 11 days. The next morning she woke at 6, before the maid, and lay in bed looking at the ceiling with her hands folded on top of the coverlet. The light through the muslin was pale and grey. A pigeon on the sill ruffled its feathers. The smell of fresh bread came up from the kitchen, faint and warm. Somewhere in the house a clock began to chime the hour, and another, half a beat behind it, took up the chime, and the two clocks together made a small, uneven music that ran through the floorboards of the bedroom, and faded. 11 days. The phrase repeated itself in her head with the cool, small ticking of the clock.
11 days, 11 days, 11 days. She lay quite still. She counted the days on her fingers. She let her hands fall again to the coverlet. The pigeon on the sill made a small, soft sound in its throat, and was silent. In those 11 days, 6 of the remaining 11 suitors came and went. They brought their gifts within the statutory limit. They took their hours by the clock. They spoke of horses, of mothers, of crop rotation, of cavalry, of pugs, and of the sea, which only one of them had seen. Aunt Lavinia, in the corner, took several hundred stitches. Sir Reginald, in his study, did not once ask whether his daughter had decided. Isadora, in the parlour, was kind to the 11, because the 11 had not asked to be on a list, and it was not their fault that they were not the man she was, by her own quiet appointment, going to marry on the morning of midsummer. Mr. Edmund Lovelace, the youngest, came twice more. The second time, he brought the book of botanical drawings. The third time, when his hour was nearly over, he set the book down on the small table and stared at the carpet, and said, with a kind of brave shaking of his shoulders, "Miss Vane, you are not going to choose me on midsummer morning, are you?" "No, Mr. Lovelace." "No, I did not think so. I was not, in any case, in love with you. I am. There is a girl in Kent. My father will not permit it. She has no fortune. I was sent to London. I was put upon the list. I have been trying very hard not to disgrace either of us." He looked at the carpet. "Forgive me. That was not. Mr. Lovelace, that was the most honest hour I have spent in this parlour in 8 weeks." He looked up. His cornflower eyes were wet. "Forgive me," he said again. "There is nothing to forgive. Take the book home. Give it to the girl in Kent. Tell her, in a year, when your father is calmer, to write to me, if she wishes a friend in town. I should like to have one." He went away with the book under his arm, and his shoulders rather straighter than they had been when he came in. Isadora watched him go. The door closed softly. She heard, in the hall, the small, light scrape of his hat against the table, the soft tread of the underfootman on the carpet, the brief, polite murmur of a wish for safe travel, the front door opening and closing, and the faint, receding clop of a horse on the cobbles of the square. Aunt Lavinia, in the corner, took her stitch, and was kindly done. "He was kind. He was the only kind one." "Not the only one, my love." "No," said Isadora after a moment. "Not the only one." The 11 days passed, in their fashion, the way all difficult days pass. Too slowly in the morning, too quickly in the afternoon, and at the wrong speed altogether in the small hours of the night. Isadora ate. She slept, a little. She dressed. She undressed. She walked in the garden of the square and noted, with a small private pleasure, that the thrush in the laurel had at last completed its phrase one afternoon, all the way through to the last clear note, and had then, evidently satisfied, stopped. 2 evenings before midsummer, Aunt Lavinia came into Isadora's bedroom and sat down on the edge of the bed with the careful slowness of a person who has, at last, made up her mind to a difficult sentence. "My dear, Aunt, I have not asked you what is in the longer note you sent. I shall not ask now. I have, however, ordered the carriage for Thursday at 9:15. The under-footman has been told there is a small errand of mine at St. James's that morning that cannot, for reasons I shall not give him, wait. He has been told to drive me there and to ask no questions and to be paid double. He has been told that you may, perhaps, also have an errand at St. James's, and that if you should happen to require a carriage, this one will be available." She looked at her embroidery. For the first time in the 8 weeks of the list, she had no embroidery in her hands. Her hands rested in her lap. They were thin, and they were veined, and they were not entirely steady. "Your father, my love, will not forgive me for this. He will forgive you. He always forgives you. He will not forgive me. Aunt, I am old. I have been forgiven for less by smaller people.
I shall manage." Lavinia looked up. Her eyes were dry, but they were not at all calm. "I should like to tell you, before Thursday, a thing I have never told you." "Yes, Art?" "There was a man, when I was your age. A second son. He had no fortune. He had a face I could not stop looking at. He asked me, in a garden in Buckinghamshire, on a midsummer evening, to come away with him on the morning following. And I said I would think about it overnight." She closed her eyes. She opened them again. "I thought, my dear, with great care, all night. By morning, I had decided. By the time I dressed and went down to breakfast and walked out into the garden to find him, he had gone. He had been called away on a family matter. By the time he came back, 6 weeks later, I had been promised to your uncle, who was a good man, and a kind man, and a generous man. And not, my love, the same man." She lifted her hands and set them flat on the coverlet. "I do not regret your uncle. I loved your uncle. I would not undo my marriage to your uncle for any prize the world could set in front of me. But I have, all the same, sat by a great many fires in a great many years, embroidering a great many cushions, thinking about a midsummer morning in a garden in Buckinghamshire, and a face I could not stop looking at, and a decision I made overnight which was not, my dear, the wrong decision, but which was the decision that closed the door on the other room of my life." She was quiet for a moment. "I do not say to you, my love, choose the Duke. I say to you, choose. Do not let the morning choose for you. Do not let the staircase choose. Do not let your father, who loves you, but who is—" she almost laughed, "who is a man, my love, and therefore not entirely to be trusted on the question of staircases. Do not let me choose. Choose, Isadora. Choose with your eyes open. And whatever you choose, I shall, on Thursday morning at 9:15, be in the carriage at the back door, and the driver will be paid double, and the door will be open." Isadora put her hand on Aunt Lavinia's hand. Aunt Lavinia turned her hand over and held it very tightly. They sat that way a long moment, the candle stub burning low between them, the small octavo bound in green calf on the table, the curtains stirring at the open window, the warm air of June moving softly through the room. "Art, my dear." "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet. Thank me on Friday morning, when we are either at St. James's or at home, and either way I shall be in a state of considerable agitation, and shall require a great deal of tea." The day before midsummer was very long. The sun rose at 3:30. The square was still grey. The plane trees were dark green and quiet. A milkmaid went past with her cans at 4:30, and a single early sparrow began the small, bright bother of its morning at 5. And the sky, over the chimneys of the houses opposite, turned, slowly, from grey through soft pearl to the bright, thin, warm, pale blue of a midsummer dawn in London. Isadora did not go down to breakfast. She did not dress. She sat in her nightgown on the window seat of her bedroom, with her knees drawn up and her cheek against the cool glass, and watched the square come awake. Cook brought up a tray at 8. The tea grew cold in the cup. The toast cooled to leather. A maid came in at 9 and took the tray away with a small, worried curtsy. By 11, Isadora had still not moved from the window. By noon, Aunt Lavinia came in and sat down on the bed and pressed the back of her cool, dry hand once to her niece's cheek. Isadora rose. She dressed. She walked in the garden of the square for an hour. The thrush in the laurel sang its few clear notes and stopped, as ever, mid-phrase, and the rare flat patch of grass under the plane trees smelled of warm earth and a little of crushed clover, and a bee, mistaken in its hour, bumbled past her shoulder and went on about its business. She watched it go. She thought of her father, who had not yet decided to keep bees. The thought, in the warm afternoon, made her smile for the first time in a week. She went back to the house at 3. She drank tea with Aunt Lavinia in the small back parlour, where Cook took her tea. The saffron roses, she observed, had wilted on Sunday and been thrown away. The bowl was now full of plain white pinks from the kitchen garden. They smelled, faintly and unexpectedly, of pepper. The night before midsummer was longer. Isadora did not sleep. She sat at her window in her nightgown, with the small octavo in her lap and the candle stub guttering on the table beside her. And she watched the square below her, the lamplighter going his rounds, the soft glow of one window opposite, where some other person, perhaps, was also not sleeping. And she thought, with the slow and very careful thinking of a person who has at last understood that the world does not, in fact, end at the foot of a staircase. She thought of the Duke. She thought of the careful absence of the touch. She thought of the small octavo bound in green calf. She thought of the handshake in the library, the smile that came at the end of 8 weeks of held breath, the indigo greatcoat, the brown eyes, the apology offered in the only room in which he was permitted to offer it. Then, in the very small hours, she thought of the staircase. She thought of her father at the foot of it, in his best coat, with the colour of a beetroot on his cheekbones, and his hands locked behind his back, watching for her. She thought of the world watching for her. The scandal sheets, the wagering book at White's, the 11 suitors arranged in 2 neat rows in the great hall of Vane House, each in his Sunday best, each holding his hat. She thought of Mr. Edmund Lovelace standing among them, with the book of botanical drawings he had not given her, looking miserable for the girl in Kent. She thought of Lord Petersmark in his nervous laugh and his anxious face. She thought of Aunt Lavinia, who had told her, in the soft voice of a woman who had decided once overnight, that she should not let the morning choose for her. And then she did the thing she had not, in 8 weeks of the list, allowed herself to do. She put down the small octavo. She walked to her writing desk. She lit a fresh candle. She took out a sheet of paper and the silver pen her mother had given her on her 16th birthday, and she wrote a letter. It was not a long letter. It was the most honest sentence she had ever written, set out in 3 parts. The first part was for her father. The second part was for the 11 suitors. The third part was for the world. To my father, she wrote, I am going to St. James's. I love him. I should rather have told you in your study, but you would have shouted, and I would have lost my courage. And you would have lost your daughter on a misunderstanding instead of on a sentence. I love him. I shall come home this evening on his arm, and you shall, if you will have us, give us our supper, because I am still your daughter and shall always be, and a marriage is not the end of a daughter, only of a list. To the 11, she wrote, I thank you for your hours, and your gifts, and your conversation. You were not the man I was going to marry. You were not, any of you, the men your fathers, or in some cases your mothers, or in 1 or 2 cases your own better selves, wished you to be in this parlour. I wish you, every one of you, to find the room in which you are permitted to say a true and inconvenient thing. To the world, she wrote, the list is over. There is no 13th man and no 12th choice. There is only a woman in a carriage at 9:30 on midsummer morning, going to a chapel in St. James's. Print what you like. I shall not read it. She sealed the 3 parts of the letter. She put them on the table. She lay down on her bed in her nightgown. She did not sleep. She watched the gray come into the window. She heard, somewhere in the house, the very small sounds of a maid laying a fire below. At 5:15 she rose. She dressed herself, slowly, in the gown she had laid out the night before, in indigo silk, plain, without ornament, of a particular dark blue that was almost, in the grey morning light, the colour of the Duke's greatcoat. She did her own hair, because the maid Aunt Lavinia had engaged was new, and would have made her late. She fastened at her throat the small pearl her mother had given her at 15. The indigo silk was cool under her fingers as she smoothed it down over her hip. The pearl was warm almost at once against the skin of her throat. She picked up the small octavo bound in green calf, opened it once, closed it again, and tucked it into a reticule beside the apple Aunt Lavinia would put in her hand at 9. The reticule felt, in her hand, a great deal heavier than its contents could possibly weigh. She slung it over her wrist anyway, with the small, steady firmness of a soldier slinging a haversack. And she went to the long glass at the end of the room and looked at herself once, very honestly, from head to foot. The face in the glass was the face of a woman of 24. It was, by some accidents of architecture, a beautiful face. But it was not, this morning, beautiful in any way that signified. It was, this morning, the face of a person who had made up her mind. She had not, before, been entirely sure what the face of a person who had made up her mind looked like. She studied it now with mild curiosity. It was, on the whole, a face she thought she could go on living with for a great many years. She turned from the glass. She picked up her gloves. She went down the back stairs. At 9:15, she walked down the back stairs of Vane House and out into the mews. The carriage was there. Aunt Lavinia was already in it, in a dove-grey silk and an absolutely steady face, with 3 folded papers in her lap. The underfootman was on the box, and he was, as Aunt Lavinia had said, being paid double. "My love." Aunt Lavinia's hand rested on her own knee. "Aunt, did you sleep?" "No, Aunt." "Did you eat?" "No, Aunt." "I have an apple, my dear, in this basket, and a small piece of bread, and a flask of weak tea. You will eat them on the way, because you cannot be married on an empty stomach. It is a superstition of mine. I have not been married on an empty stomach. I have, however, attended a great many weddings of women who were, and they have all of them, without exception, complained afterwards of the headache. Aunt." Aunt Lavinia's hand was warm and steady on the lid of the basket. "Eat the apple, my dear." Isadora ate the apple. The carriage rolled out of the mews. The morning was warm and clear. The sun fell on the rooftops of the square. In a window across the street, a maid was opening a curtain. The under-footman flicked the reins. The horses stepped out. At the corner of the square, a boy was already running with the first of the day's sheets in his hand, calling them by the headline. But Isadora did not hear what the headline was, because at that moment, Aunt Lavinia took her hand and held it very tightly, and said, with her eyes fixed straight ahead on the back of the under-footman's coat, "He will be there, my love. He will be there." She did not weep. She held her face quite steady, by the smallest fraction of an inch. "He has had the discipline not to slam a door for 8 weeks. He will, this morning, open one." The carriage turned out of the square into the avenue, and the wheels rang on the cobbles, and the morning of midsummer was very bright. The chapel at St. James's stood square and pale at the end of a short, cobbled street. The morning sun was already strong on its yellow stone. A wagon was being unloaded at the door of a baker's shop opposite, and the smell of warm crust came soft along the pavement. And a small, thin cat sat in the gutter, washing its paws with great deliberation. And a single late lamp at the far corner of the street had not yet been put out by the lamplighter. He was there. He stood at the chapel door at St. James's at 9:30 precisely, in a dark coat that was not, today, indigo, but was an unembarrassed deep peacock blue, with a white cravat, with his brown hair brushed back and his brown eyes very steady. And the moment the carriage came round the corner of the street, he stepped down from the chapel step and walked across the cobbles to the carriage door and opened it himself, before the under-footman could even reach for the reins. Isadora. Adrian. His brown eyes had gone bright with something he was not, this morning, troubling to conceal. You came. She held his gaze without difficulty. I said I would. Yes, he said, and his voice was a little unsteady. You said you would. He handed her down. He handed Aunt Lavinia down. On neither occasion did he hold the hand a moment longer than the gesture required. The discipline was, by now, a habit. The habit was a kindness. The curate was waiting. He was a thin young man with kind eyes and a slightly anxious smile, and he had, the Duke explained on the chapel step, been very quietly engaged a week before by a letter from a stone house in Derbyshire, which had asked, with great politeness, whether he would be free at 9:30 on the morning of midsummer to perform a marriage by special license for a bride who might or might not appear, and would, in either case, be paid for his time. The curate had agreed. The curate had spent, by his own confession on the step, the worst 3 nights of his life waiting for the morning. The chapel was almost empty. A verger in a corner, a single old woman in a pew at the back, with a basket on her knee and her bonnet pulled forward, who had come, by the look of her, to escape from a husband she did not entirely like. Aunt Lavinia, in dove grey, took her place at the front of the side pew. The Duke took Isadora's hand. The curate opened the book. The chapel was cool and very quiet. The smell of old stone and old wood and a faint sweetness of beeswax hung in the air. The high windows were full of bright June sky. A bar of warm sun fell across the floor at the foot of the altar steps. The curate's white surplice was very clean. His hands on the book trembled once, and were steady. Isadora stood at the foot of the altar steps in her plain indigo silk, with the small pearl at her throat. Her husband-to-be stood beside her in his peacock blue coat, with his brown hair brushed back and his brown eyes very steady. The bar of warm sun caught the gilt of the cross on the altar, and the soft, worn gilt of the cross was, for a moment, almost too bright to look at. It was a very short service. The Duke had given a great deal of thought, on the morning, to the question of the vow. He had decided, in the carriage on the way to the chapel, that he would say it in the plainest possible way, in the plainest possible voice, because the vow was the thing for which all the previous discipline had been the rehearsal. He said it now, with his brown eyes on Isadora's grey ones, with his fingers steady on hers, with no flourish and no ornament. He said her name. He said his own. He said the words. He said them, the curate later told Aunt Lavinia at the small breakfast that followed, like a man who had been waiting a very long time to be permitted to say them aloud. Isadora said her vow with the same plainness. Her voice was quiet. It did not break. The pearl at her throat caught the light from the high window. The peacock blue silk of the Duke's coat was a particular bright spot at the edge of her vision. The careful absence of the touch was over. His hand was warm and quite steady. Her hand was warm and quite steady. They held each other lightly, because they were going to hold each other for, with luck, a great many years. And there was no need, this morning, to grip. The curate pronounced them man and wife. The verger, in the corner, allowed himself a small private smile. The old woman in the back pew, who had come to escape from a husband, lifted her chin and dabbed once at the corner of her eye with the edge of her shawl. Aunt Lavinia, in dove grey, sat very still, with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the gold cross above the altar, as though it had personally arranged the morning for her benefit. Outside the high window, a sparrow was singing on a slate, and a barrow was rattling somewhere in the next street, and the small bell at the top of the chapel tower stirred once in the warm air, and was silent. The Duke chose, in the chapel, not to kiss her. He had decided, on the morning, that the chapel was not the room for it, because there was a verger, and an old woman, and an aunt, and a curate, and the room for a first kiss was, in his opinion, a room in which the only persons present were the persons who were doing the kissing. He led her instead, by the hand, down the short aisle, and out of the chapel door, and onto the chapel step in the morning sun of midsummer. He stopped on the step. He turned her, very gently, to face him. He looked at her for a moment, as though to be quite sure she was real. Then he bent his head, in the bright, open morning, on the chapel step at St. James's, in full view of the verger and the old woman, and Aunt Lavinia and the curate, and the underfootman, and a small boy with a newspaper who happened, at that moment, to be passing. And he kissed her, very softly, on the corner of her mouth. And he straightened, and he said, in the voice she had heard for the first time 3 months before, in the back of a library on Cavendish Square, "Mrs. Ashbourne, welcome to the rest of it." The small boy with the newspaper stopped in the street. He stared. He had been carrying, on his arm, a stack of the day's sheets, freshly printed. The headline across the top of every one of them was, "The 12 suitors gather. Miss Vane to choose at noon." He looked at the chapel step. He looked at the headline. He looked at the chapel step again. His mouth opened. He shut it. He turned, with the unerring instinct of his trade, and ran, very fast, back the way he had come, with the stack of headlines under his arm, and a much better one in his head. The Duke laughed. "There," he said. "That is the front page for tomorrow." "And the day after?" "The day after," he said, "we shall be in Derbyshire, and there will be no sheets at all, because the village does not run to them, and the only news will be that the wild roses in the hedge by the south lawn have opened all at once, and the hedge for 2 days together is nothing but white. I have, in fact, ordered the wild roses to do so. They have agreed. They are an obliging hedge." "You are absurd." "Yes. I have hidden it from you, until now, with considerable effort. I shall not hide it any more. You will have to live with it." "I shall manage." "You shall have to manage with a great many other things also. I have an aunt as alarming as yours. I have a tolerable horse. I have a face which, you have informed me at some risk to your reputation, is not unpleasant in candlelight. I have a small library that wants a reader. I have, I am afraid, no other recommendations. None. None worth listing." "Then it is just as well," said Isidora, "that I do not propose to make a list." He did then, for the first time in 8 weeks, laugh openly, with his head thrown back a little, in the bright morning sun of midsummer on the chapel step at St. James's, and Aunt Lavinia, on the step behind him, took out her handkerchief, and pretended to dust it, and pretended she was not dusting her eyes. The carriage came round. The Duke handed Isidora in. The Duke handed Aunt Lavinia in. The Duke stepped in himself and sat opposite. The underfootman, with his second double-paid task of the morning, flicked the reins. The horses stepped out. The wheels rang on the cobbles. The sun was now full on the front of the chapel. The thin cat in the gutter watched the carriage go past, with the polite indifference of a creature whose own morning was more important. A church clock somewhere in the next street rang the 3/4. The smell of warm crust hung soft on the air for a long moment after the carriage had passed, and then the smell was gone, and the morning of midsummer in London went on about its business in the bright, clear, warm air of a fine June day. Inside the carriage, the Duke had taken Isidora's hand. He held it lightly, with his thumb against the inside of her wrist where the pulse was. Aunt Lavinia, opposite them, had at last permitted her face to soften, and she sat with her dove-grey gloves folded in her lap, and her eyes on the seam of the carriage roof, and a small private smile at the corner of her mouth that she let stand, for the entire length of the drive, in plain view. They went back by the long route to Vane House. They went up the front steps. The Duke gave his arm to Isidora. Aunt Lavinia walked behind them, dry-eyed, and quite as alarming as any aunt could wish to be. Sir Reginald was in the great hall. He had, on the news of the empty staircase, summoned the 11 suitors out of the parlour and into the hall, where they stood now in 2 awkward rows in their Sunday best, each with his hat in his hand, each entirely unsure what was happening. The wagering book at White's, by this time, would already have heard. The headline was already, in the head of a small boy with a newspaper, halfway to a printer. The morning was very bright through the long sash windows of the hall. Sir Reginald looked at his daughter. He looked at the Duke. He looked at the 11 men in 2 rows. He looked at his daughter again. He drew, very slowly, the breath of a man who has just understood, after 8 weeks of small misunderstandings, the only true sentence he had ever needed to know about his own child. He walked the length of the hall. He stopped in front of the Duke. He held out his hand. "Your Grace." "Sir Reginald." Their hands met above the polished wood of the hall table. They shook hands. It was a plain handshake, like a tradesman closing a bargain. Sir Reginald held it perhaps a heartbeat longer than was necessary, and the Duke held the gaze for that exact heartbeat. Then Sir Reginald turned to the 2 rows of 11 men, and he said, in a voice that was almost, but not entirely, steady, "Gentlemen, I have in this matter behaved as a fool. I had set out a list. I had set out rules. I had supposed that the world might be ordered by the printing of a card. The world, I am informed by my daughter, is not so ordered. I beg your pardon for the hours of your spring. I beg your pardon for the gifts within statutory limits. I beg, in particular, the pardon of any one of you who came to this house in the honest hope of a wife. I cannot give you a wife. I can give you breakfast. The dining room is through there. You will find, I trust, that the kitchen has prepared more than enough." There was a small, astonished silence. Then Lord Petersmark, who had not, in any prior moment of his life, been the first to do anything, gave a thin, anxious laugh and said, "Sir Reginald, on the whole, I should rather have the breakfast." And 1 or 2 of the others laughed, and then more of them laughed, and Mr. Edmund Lovelace, at the back, looked at the carpet and smiled, very privately, into his collar, and thought of a girl in Kent. They went, in 2 awkward rows, into breakfast. The dining room, by the smell of it, had been preparing for the morning since 5. Kippers, kidneys, devilled eggs, a great cold ham on the sideboard, a tower of warm rolls, an absurd silver dish of strawberries with white sugar, a stoneware jug of cream, the colour of clotted ivory. Sir Reginald had ordered, as he had ordered everything for the past 3 months, on a scale considerably grander than the occasion required. The 11 gentlemen filed in their Sunday best, with the look of men who had at last understood what kind of morning they had walked into, and had decided, on the whole, to make the best of it. Lord Petersmark made directly for the strawberries. Colonel Hayde took up a strategic position beside the ham, with the air of a man who would now stand his ground. Mr. Edmund Lovelace stood for a moment at the door, with his hat still in his hand, and then, very quietly, he set the hat on the side table and went in. Sir Reginald stood a moment in the hall, alone but for his daughter and his new son-in-law and his sister. "Lavinia?" "Reginald?" "You knew." "I knew." "You did not tell me." "I did not tell you, Reginald. I am sorry. I have been waiting, all my life, to be allowed to do one large, foolish thing without consulting you. I have done it. I am, on the whole, not sorry." He looked at her. The colour of a beetroot was, at last, leaving his cheekbones. The morning light fell soft on his face. "Lavinia," he said, very quietly. "Thank you." Her hand, in his sister's careful way, found his. They stood that way a long moment. Then Sir Reginald turned to Isadora, and he set his other hand on her shoulder, very gently, and he said, "My dear, welcome home." "I am home, Papa." "Yes." He looked at her. He almost laughed. "I rather see that you are." The journey north took 3 days. Isadora saw, for the first time in her life, the Peak Country in late June. Long, pale green hills, low stone walls running over them like the seams of a great quilt. Sheep in the high pastures, the soft splash of streams under low, arched bridges, the warm honey colour of the stone in the villages where they changed horses. She rode beside her husband in an open chaise the second afternoon, and the wind smelled of cut hay and warm bracken, and a lark went up out of a field beside the road, and sang an unreasonably long song against the bright, pale sky. 6 weeks later, on a soft August morning, at the stone house in Derbyshire, Isadora Ashbourne came down the great staircase of her own house in a plain morning gown of ruby silk, with her hair simply done and her shoes very quiet on the steps. Her husband was at the foot of the staircase. He was reading a letter. He looked up as she came down. He held the letter loosely. The August morning came warm through the open door of the stone house. The hedge of wild roses on the south lawn shone a clean, bright white in the soft sun. "From your aunt," he said. "She informs us that the 11 gentlemen have every one of them recovered from the morning of midsummer. She informs us in particular
that Mr. Edmund Lovelace has married his girl in Kent, that Lord Petersmark has become engaged to a young lady from Northumberland with very firm views on the colour of curtains, and that Mr. Cassian Frost has been seen in Lisbon on the arm of a French marquise who, your aunt is delighted to report, has the reputation of being a snake of considerable ability. He folded the letter. She also informs us that your father is taking up beekeeping. She turned the word over once. Beekeeping. Beekeeping. He has decided, she says, that bees are the only creatures who do not require to be set out on a card. He has ordered 6 hives. He is extremely happy. Isadora reached the foot of the staircase. She stopped on the last step. Her husband held out his hand. She put hers in it. He did not press. He held a moment longer than the gesture required. Mrs. Ashbourne. Mr. Ashbourne. There is a thing on the south lawn I should like you to see. What thing? A hedge of wild roses. They have, since Tuesday, opened all at once. The hedge, for 2 days together, is going to be nothing but white. I had given orders. They have complied. They are an obliging hedge. The morning sun came soft through the open door of the stone house. You are still absurd. Yes, I shall be absurd, my love, every morning for the rest of our lives. On this staircase, and on every other staircase we shall come down together. You may, if you like, set it down on a card. You may print it in any sheet you choose. There will be no 12. There will be no 13th. There will be no rules. There will only be a hedge of wild roses in Derbyshire on a Tuesday in August, and a stone house, and a small library that has, at last, found its reader, and a man on a staircase who has been waiting since October to take his wife by the hand and walk her out into the morning. She laughed. It was a quiet laugh in the soft August morning, in her own house, on her own staircase, and it was the most honest sound she had made in 9 months. Then take me out into the morning, Adrian. He took her by the hand. He walked her down the last step. He opened the door of the stone house onto the wide green lawn. The hedge along the southern boundary was, as he had promised, opening into white. The wild roses moved a little in the August breeze. A bee, perhaps in a year or two one of her father's, having travelled north out of curiosity, bumbled past her ear and went on about its business. And Isadora Ashbourne stepped out into the bright morning on the arm of the Duke who had refused her father's list. And the hedge, on cue, was nothing in the whole length of it but white.